Good morning, Vikes. Welcome to class today. So yesterday we kind of had to end early. Not really ending early, but we didn't have enough time to address probably the biggest question about yesterday's assignment, and that was the quick write at the bottom of the audience analysis. And so the question I was asking was, how would you describe the audience of this text? How are the writer's rhetorical choices, for example, language, style, structure, evidence, appeals, etc., suited to the needs, interests, and expectations of this audience? And that last sentence there, that last question is the critical question. That's the one that I want you to be able to answer. And so I wanted to look at a few examples here that students had written yesterday and take a look at some of the strengths of these examples and some of the things that we need to work on. So for this first example here, we'll go back up to their audience here. They said that, well, first the thesis. America has more opportunities and freedom compared to the European countries. So then for the audience, they identified oppressed lower class to middle class young men in search of freedom and opportunity to move up in social status. So they've identified some characteristics, motives or interests of that group, what Crèvecoeur wanted them to respond, and then the worldview that they share. And this is what they came up with for their description and their rhetorical analysis. The audience of the text are the ones in Europe that were oppressed under the monarch government. So that one we can clearly state. That was clear in the text that he's making, Crèvecoeur is making references to the monarchies. Under this government, there were strict religious guidelines, and it was hard to get past the current social status, which was usually the lower or middle class. To these audiences, the writer uses many techniques to appeal to the interests of the readers. For example, the writer appeals to the audience by listing the hardships one may go through living in his current country. It draws the audience's attention because it fits his description of daily life. The writer also structures his writing so that the positives of America are introduced in the later paragraphs. He offers the audience the negatives of their current lives and hope for the future, calling them to action. So this is a pretty good rhetorical analysis here. Some of the things that I particularly like about this one. So right here, the writer says, to these audiences, the writer uses many techniques to appeal to the interests of the readers. Now, immediately when I look at this, I want to know, do you have proof? And sure enough, this student has proof. For example, the writer appeals to the audience by listing the hardships one may go through living in his current country. So there is the example of one of the techniques that Crèvecoeur uses in writing this. And then the author here gives an explanation. It draws the audience's attention because it fits his description of daily life. So there's a good piece of rhetorical analysis right there. So let's look at another example here. In this one, they've identified the audience as unmarried poor men who live in Europe. And down here for the quick write. The author gives vivid imagery so that the audience can better visualize the message that he is giving to them. He also uses ethos to appeal to the audience by evoking pity for themselves. He says how much worse Europe is compared to America, which leads them to want to come. He's offering another chance at success to the poor and hopeless men in Europe. For every fault in Europe, he gives a way that America solves the problem. So this is good rhetorical analysis. There's one thing here that I want to point out that is, I believe, inaccurate. So the writer says he also uses ethos to appeal to the audience by evoking pity for themselves. If you're evoking pity, that's an emotion, and emotion is pathos. Ethos is credibility. So that sentence has nothing to do with credibility. And also, we are never going to say that a writer uses ethos or uses pathos or uses logos. They appeal to those. So that's something that we'll work on a little bit more. But what I do like about this rhetorical analysis here is we have a specific example, vivid imagery, and then an explanation of why that appeals to the audience. Remember, that's what I asked you to do. How does it appeal to the audience? so that the audience can better visualize the message that he is giving to them. And then this writer uses the comparison, or points out the comparison that Crèvecoeur uses. He says how much worse Europe is compared to America, which leads them to want to come. And then there's the appeal. He's offering another chance at success to the poor and hopeless men in Europe. So here's a description right here of our audience. And for every fault in Europe, he gives a way that America solves the problem. So using the comparison, emphasizing that Crèvecoeur uses the comparison, that is good rhetorical analysis. So we have another one here. In this one, the thesis is his primary message is that the Americans were far more independent than the Europeans, where the Europeans heavily relied on their governments and such for food and land. America provided much more freedom and liberal ideologies. And then the audience, Europeans unfamiliar with America who are looking into moving to America. All right, and then for the quick write. I would overall describe them as the less fortunate people of Europe who are too desperate to serve themselves rather than a corrupt monarch. So there's a pretty good description of the audience. I find the moment where he states, can a wretch who wanders about, who works and starves, whose life is a continual scene of sore affliction or pinching penury, can that man call England or any other kingdom his country? A country that had no bread for him, whose fields procured him no harvest, who met with nothing but the frowns of the rich, the severity of the laws with jails and punishments, who owned not a single foot of the extensive surface of this planet? No. Now, that's a great quote, but there's a lot of it. And so when you're doing your rhetorical analysis, you're probably going to want to truncate that, meaning shorten it. That's too much quote. But it's an excellent quote, and you can certainly pull parts of that out. And when you're doing your rhetorical analysis, one thing to remember is that the audience has read the piece of work that you are analyzing, so they're familiar with it. So you could probably say, I find the moment, the rhetorical question where he starts, can a wretch who wanders about, ... The person knows that you know what you're talking about, even if you do that. So anyway, the sentence isn't even finished here, finds that quote to be the most relevant as he uses a rhetorical question to point out the greed and power of the European monarchs. So that's an excellent piece of rhetorical analysis right there. There is the specific rhetorical device. We talked about that last week, the rhetorical question. Socrates used it a lot, used to guide people to a particular point. Of course, you have to explain what that point is, and this writer does that, to point out the greed and power of the European monarchs. In the reading, he later rambles on about the freedom of America and how you can serve your own self-interest rather than kneel to a king. I take issue with the word ramble. Ramble seems like he's going on without really a point or a purpose, but he definitely has a purpose with all of this. In fact, you identified it up here. So, but that would be my only question there about the word ramble. But again, we're talking about what Crèvecoeur does to accomplish that purpose. And in this specific case, how does this piece meet the needs, the interests, and the expectations of this audience? So that's quite a bit. I know there were several of you who kind of struggled with that yesterday, and that's okay. This is kind of the first time we've really done this kind of analysis, and we're going to have to do it many times to make sure that we smooth it out a little bit. But I want you to try again. So what I've got for you on Google Classroom today, I want you to go back to The Crisis by Thomas Paine. I gave you a short selection of that piece yesterday, or not yesterday, last week. Read through that again. You'll find it in your assignments from last week. And then you're going to note on Google Classroom today, there is another copy of the audience analysis. I want you to complete that audience analysis as much as you possibly can. We need some context, though. On one of the assignments from last week with The Crisis, I gave you just a very short box that gave you a little bit of context. I want to give you some more. So there are 2 links attached to the assignment today. One of the links takes you to history.com. I think it's history.com or history.org. Anyway, follow the link, and it's a short piece that gives a little bit of background about the crisis. Also, I'm providing you with the Wikipedia link. Take a look just at those first two paragraphs at the top of the Wikipedia page. Again, gives you some context for that older piece of text. Once you know that context, then you're much better established to do the audience analysis. Hopefully this helps you get through and figure out how to better do the rhetorical analysis on the quick write for today's activity, and then we can come back and take a look at it on Thursday. Get your work done today. It counts for attendance for today, but also take tomorrow off. Don't do any schoolwork. Don't even do my schoolwork, God forbid. But if you want to read, that's fine. All right. Take care, Vikes.